In the early 2000s, the PlayStation was still producing some quality games that were definitely able to compete with some of the heavy hitters that were seen on other consoles. While many people were starting to move on to the next generation, there was a lot of gamers that still decided to stick with what they knew and what they thought was best, and the PlayStation was still the home to many, myself included. And there was some really cool and very quirky games being released at that time still, and Firebugs is a game that definitely falls under that category, as it is a futuristic racing game that was developed by attention to detail and was published by Sony Computer Entertainment, and it was released exclusively for the PlayStation in 2002. And with it being a futuristic racer, it has a lot of unique qualities, many of which are very, very familiar to the iconic Roll Cage series of games that had been developed and published by Psygnosis only a few years prior, in the late 90s on the PlayStation also. And the Roll Cage series were considered to be some of the most iconic racing games seen on the platform at that time. So Firebugs takes a lot of inspiration from those games, with its unique kind of style, vehicles, track layouts, pretty much how the game plays. You can definitely tell that it's heavily inspired by Roll Cage, and for all intents and purposes. So the game allows you to take control of 5 different vehicles, all set in futuristic environments and tracks, and each vehicle has access to an array of weapons and defensive abilities, but also have their own unique characteristics that are only specific to each vehicle individually. And the game does give you access to different modes where you can play through a single player campaign, even a 2-player mode, so you can play against your mates and compete. But even with the 1-player mode, you go through various tournaments that you can race across a variety of different tracks, 25 in total, across 5 different world types, all set within futuristic environments, cityscapes, skyports, and pretty much just very unique type of areas to explore. And the graphics and the visual preferences really reflect the vibe and style that it was going for, and really suits the whole aesthetic. And if you have played the Roll Cage games, you can definitely see the unique appeal and the style in which it's trying to go for, and Firebugs again does the same in respects to it. Ideally, if you'd like to think of it this way, that Firebugs is primarily the spiritual successor to Roll Cage, even though it wasn't primarily developed essentially by the same company, but it was heavily inspired by those earlier games. And it was very reflective in its reviews, because the game did receive many positive reviews and unique feedback from a variety of different games magazines that were being published at the time, stating that they liked the unique appeal of the game and the influences of the Roll Cage games in it more specifically, because Roll Cage had a very big following at that time. And it's easy to see why. It's fast paced, it's frantic, there's a lot of unique appeal, it has a really good multiplayer mode, it has a great soundtrack, and it's very reflective of its time as well. Plus, these type of games are also a really good alternative to the iconic Wipeout games that were also seen on the system during that time. And for me personally, the Wipeout games that were released originally on the PS1, like Wipeout 1, 2 and 3, and even the Wipeout 3 Special Edition, I think are definitely the best versions of any of the Wipeout games that's ever been released in the series. While we have had later entries on the PS2, PSP, PS Vita and even more modern systems, while they are great games in their own right, I still think that personally the PS1 games, the earlier games in the series, are by far the best. And the same can be pretty much said for the likes of these type of games with Firebugs and Roll Cage and so forth. It's just, I think the visual style of the 32-bit era, and with the likes of the graphics of the PlayStation console itself, it really suits the whole dynamic and the aesthetic that is on offer. There's just something about the low poly visuals that it really suits the futuristic style of these games. And I suppose that goes back into relation to when the PlayStation originally came out back in 94 and 95. The whole idea and premise behind the PlayStation console is that it was the future, and everything about it at that time was futuristic kind of based or styled. Like when you look at the Wipeout games and you look at other games that came out after it, there was a lot of games that covered that unique dynamic, and everything was kind of based in the future, almost ahead of its time, if you will. So it definitely got that image right in terms of its preferences. And Firebugs was definitely one of the later games that come out during the midpoint or towards the ends of the PlayStation's life cycle, but it still managed to capture that unique vibe to it that earlier games had managed to replicate or master as such. Like in Firebugs itself, the gameplay is very fast paced, it's very challenging. The tracks now, mind you, are quite short. Even though there's a multitude of different tracks available, you'll have races done in a matter of only a minute or two, give or take, and a lot of it is dependent on skill. But when you get familiar with your environment and your surroundings, and if you can utilise weapons and defensive tactics to your advantage, you will definitely have a really good chance of winning races quite easily. But at the same time, it does provide a decent challenge for fans of the likes of Roll Cage and so forth. It just has some really cool quirks, and when you couple it with its unique soundtrack that was very reflective of its time with dance and kind of like techno and all that futuristic style music, it definitely suits the tone of the game. So that in itself is another reason why I would recommend that you play it. Even for myself personally, going back, I had seen Firebugs on like store shelves when I used to go in to look at games to buy, but I never got round to playing it. While I like the look of it, because I had played the Roll Cage games and I thought they were brilliant. But it's only until recent times I managed to sit down to play it. And I have to say, it is a very, very good alternative. Probably one of the best alternatives I've personally played to Roll Cage that you can get out there. While it is a bit more simple in terms of how it plays, Roll Cage is definitely the more difficult game to master, but this is definitely a worthwhile alternative in all respects to it. So I would highly recommend that you do check this game out if you are a fan of these futuristic styled racing games, especially on the PS1. But I would love to know your thoughts on Firebugs and what do you think of the game overall yourself. Are you a fan of these type of racing games? Or are you a fan of the Roll Cage style games, and would you be willing to play an alternative to them? So be sure to shout it in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other types of racing games similar to Firebugs, also released on the PlayStation, you can check out the playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And be sure to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to be updated of future content. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.